She ran through a dying town with a man's bullet kicking up dirt 2 inches from her feet. Every door in that street slammed shut. Every window went dark. Every person who could have helped her looked away. Every person except one. He was a stranger with a false name, a wanted past, and every reason in the world to keep writing. He had spent 2 years learning how to need nothing and want nothing and feel nothing. And then he saw her face. What happened next would cost them everything: the farm, the safety, the careful distance he had built between himself and the world. It would drag them through gunfights and betrayal and a truth so devastating it nearly destroyed what they had found. But some things, once seen, cannot be unseen. And some people, once chosen, change the direction of your entire life. This is their story. Here on this channel, we tell the stories that the frontier never forgot: Western love, loyalty tested by fire, the bond between mothers and children, and the quiet courage of ordinary people who chose to be extraordinary when it mattered most. The lesson this story carries: freedom is not something that happens to you. It is something you choose, even when choosing it costs everything you have. If this story moves you the way it moved us, hit that like button, leave us a comment telling us which moment stayed with you longest, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe so you never miss the next one. We will be here every week with a new story worth staying for.
I have ridden through 40 towns that looked exactly like Dust Haven. And I can tell you that they all have the same smell, not the smell of wood smoke or livestock or the particular brand of Wyoming dust that gets into your teeth and stays there. The smell, I mean, is older than any of those things. It is the smell of people who have stopped expecting anything to change. It settles into the boards of the buildings and the fabric of the curtains, and the way a man holds his shoulders when he walks past the sheriff's office without looking at it. Dust Haven had that smell from a mile out. I pulled Ash to a stop at the crest of the low ridge that overlooked the town and sat there for a few minutes, letting her breathe after the long morning ride and letting myself read what was below us. 2 years of living in a cabin above the tree line had made me careful about towns. You learn to look before you descend. You learn to identify the shape of a place before you commit yourself to being inside it. What I saw was a market day in a town that had been systematically drained of something vital. The main street was active enough: wagons, livestock, the movement of commerce doing what commerce does. Children running between the adults, women with baskets, men in conversation outside the feed store and the land office and the saloon that occupied the corner lot at the east end of the street. From a distance, it looked ordinary. From a distance, most things that are wrong look ordinary. What I was reading was the details. The way the sheriff's office sat directly across the street from the bank, angled so that whoever sat at the deputy's desk had a clear line of sight to the bank's front door, not for the bank's protection, for the bank's convenience. The way a farmer loading grain onto his wagon went completely still and kept his eyes on his work when a particular black-painted freight wagon rolled past him on its way to the stockyard. The way his stillness was not the stillness of a man ignoring something, but the stillness of a man who has learned that being noticed is a cost he cannot afford. The way strangers were not looked at directly, not because the people of Dust Haven were unfriendly, because friendliness had become, for them, a form of exposure. I had seen all 3 of those signs before, in different configurations, in different towns across Wyoming and Colorado and the eastern edge of Utah Territory. They added up to the same arithmetic every time. Someone owned this place, not in the sense that a mayor owns civic responsibility or a sheriff owns the peace, owned it the way a man owns a tool, for what it produces and what it can be made to do. I did not intend to find out who that someone was. I needed ammunition, salt, a hot meal, and a night in a bed that was not the ground. I planned to be gone before the following morning. I rode Ash down the ridge and into town, keeping her to a walk, attracting no particular attention. A man on a gray mare passing through, nothing to file away. I had been nobody in particular for 2 years and had gotten reasonably good at it. I tied Ash outside Ruth's boarding house, which the painted sign above the door identified as offering rooms, meals, and what it called reasonable company, which I took to mean conversation was available but not required. I went inside. The room smelled of coffee and fresh cornbread, and the wood smoke that had been soaking into the walls for however many winters the building had been standing. 6 tables, 4 of them occupied. A woman behind the counter who I put at 65, with gray streaks running through dark hair, and the kind of eyes that have processed enough human behavior to stop being surprised by most of it. She looked at me the way people look at strangers when they have enough information to make a preliminary judgment and are waiting for confirmation. I sat at the table nearest the window, where I could see the street and the door simultaneously, and ordered coffee and whatever was in the pot. The coffee came black and strong. The pot held a beef stew that had been cooking long enough to have opinions about it. I was halfway through both when I heard the voice. She was at the far end of the counter, and the first thing I registered was not what she looked like, but how she sounded. Not raised, not frightened, not pleading or demanding in any of the registers that desperation usually produces. She was speaking with the precision of someone who had prepared this argument carefully and was delivering it from a position of thorough preparation, like a lawyer who has read every relevant document and is not impressed by the opposition's case. I turned enough to see her without making the turn obvious. She was perhaps 28 years old, dark hair coming loose from a practical arrangement at the back of her neck. A dress that had been good quality at some earlier point in its life and had since been modified in ways that prioritized function over appearance. Road dust on her boots. She was holding a folded document in one hand and pointing with the other to a specific section of it, explaining something to the man in the deputy's badge, who was standing across the counter from her, with his arms crossed and his face doing the particular thing that men's faces do when they are losing an argument and know it, and intend to resolve the situation through authority rather than logic. She was citing contract language, specific paragraph references. She was not asking him to understand it. She was making clear that she understood it, and that she understood it better than he did, and that this understanding had legal implications he was going to have to account for. The deputy's face went progressively redder. He grabbed the document out of her hand and tore it in half. The room went quiet. Not the dramatic silence of a moment of violence, but the worse silence of people who have seen a version of this before and have already made their private calculations about the cost of involvement. Plates continued to exist. Coffee cups continued to be held. But the noise of people being normally present in a room ceased completely. The woman, I did not know her name yet, went very still. The color left her face, and I watched what replaced it, because the replacement was informative. It was not fear. Fear collapses people inward. What replaced the color in her face made her more present, not less. Her jaw set. Her shoulders, already straight, became straighter. The stillness of her was the stillness of someone converting shock directly into resolve without pausing at grief. She looked around the room, slowly, one face at a time, looking for a single person willing to hold her gaze. The farmer at the corner table studied his stew. The 2 men near the door found something interesting happening outside the window. The woman refilling coffee cups along the far wall developed a pressing need to attend to the cups. One by one, every person in that room declined the invitation. Except me. I looked at her for exactly 1 second. No expression, no offer, no promise of anything. Just the simple acknowledgement of direct eye contact. I see you. I know what is happening here. You are not invisible to me. She held it for that 1 second. Then she looked away, and the deputy was already moving toward the door, and the room exhaled, and the ordinary sounds of a meal being consumed resumed, as if a brief technical interruption had been resolved. I finished my coffee, I left coins on the table for the meal in the room, picked up my hat, and went out to collect ash. I had my hand on the saddle horn when Ruth McAllister appeared in the doorway behind me. She did not raise her voice. She had the manner of a woman who had stopped needing to raise her voice some years back, because she had learned that the right words delivered at the right moment carry further than volume. She said, "That girl has been fighting Harlan Voss in every legal way available to her for 8 months. Tonight she runs out of legal options." I said it was not my business. She said, "That is what the last man said. He left on a Tuesday. She nearly did not make it to Wednesday." I stood at the hitching post with my hand on Ash's saddle in the cold coming down off the mountains the way it comes in Wyoming autumn, which is not gradually but decisively like a door being shut. The sun was going behind the western ridge. The sky above the peaks was the particular shade of orange that precedes a cold and cloudless night. I should ride. I had supplies to collect, and a cabin 4 hours north that was stocked for one and suited for isolation, and asked nothing of me that I was not prepared to give. I stood there for a long moment. Then I let go of the saddle. I went back inside and told Ruth McAllister that I would take a room for the night, and that she should tell me whatever she thought I needed to know about Harlan Voss. She poured me more coffee, sat down across from me at the table by the window, and talked for 40 minutes without stopping. By the time she was done, I understood the shape of what I had walked into, and I understood that walking back out of it was going to require a deliberate decision I was not yet certain I had made. But I stayed. That night at least I stayed. She came back to Ruth's at 10 o'clock that night, not through the front door. I was sitting at the window of my second-floor room, unable to sleep, which had been my primary relationship with sleep for going on 2 years, when I saw a movement in the alley below. She was coming from the direction of the deputy's office at a pace that was trying to be controlled and was not entirely succeeding. Behind her, at a distance that was closing, 2 men who had the look of people being paid to retrieve something. I had maybe 30 seconds. I went downstairs and out the back, came around the side of the grain store at the far end of the alley, and found the most useful thing available to me in the immediate vicinity, which was a full water trough connected to a hitching rail where 4 horses were tied. I tipped the trough. 4 horses simultaneously discovered that they had strong opinions about cold water and expressed them with vigor. The 2 men chasing her were between those horses and the noise I made doing it. And for about 45 seconds, the alley at the north end of town became very fully occupied with horses that were not interested in being managed. She made it to the gap behind the grain store and stopped, breathing hard, the document she had recovered held against her chest with both hands. I appeared out of the darkness beside her and said nothing. She looked at me for a moment that seemed to last longer than it did. Then she said, "What do you want?" I had helped people in bad situations for most of my working life. As a Pinkerton detective, I had recovered stolen property, located missing persons, served legal papers in situations where the recipients were not enthusiastic about receiving them. I had operated in the gray territories between law and justice more times than I could accurately count. In all of that, no one had asked me that question, that directly, that fast. People in extremity tend to accept help and ask questions later. They are focused on the immediate problem and they reach for whatever appears to address it without interrogating the hand that offers it. This woman was interrogating the hand. I said I wanted to make sure she got somewhere safe. She said, "That is not an answer to my question." She was correct. It was a deflection dressed as an answer, and she had identified it immediately. I did not have a better response prepared, which was itself unusual. I am a trained observer of human behavior and a reasonably skilled conversationalist when the situation calls for it. Standing in the dark behind a grain store in Dust Haven, Wyoming, I could not think of a single thing to say to Eleanor Callahan that was both honest and adequate. That bothered me more than it should have. It still does when I think about it. Ruth hid us in the storage room behind the kitchen, which she did with the efficiency of someone who had thought through this possibility in advance and prepared accordingly. There were 2 crates that could be moved to block the interior door, a lamp with enough oil, and a supply of blankets that suggested the room had been used for this purpose before. We sat on opposite sides of the small space, her on a flour sack and me on a crate, and she told me what I needed to know. Not everything. I could hear the edges of what she was leaving out the way you hear a missing instrument in a piece of music. But enough. Harlan Voss, owner of Crestfall County Bank, and the majority of commercial property between Dusthaven and the county line. Her father's farm, 160 acres of good land with a creek and a small herd and a wheat crop that had struggled through 2 bad seasons. A debt that had grown somehow faster than it should have, until the bank held more of the farm than Seamus Callahan did. A marriage contract that Voss had presented as the solution. The debt forgiven, the farm saved, Ellie's future secured. Her father's signature on the document and hers, given in a situation that she was now arguing with considerable legal precision, did not constitute valid consent. The document she had recovered tonight was a prior version of the contract, one that contained language Voss had subsequently amended, and the original language was exculpatory in ways the revised version was not. When she finished, I said, "What are you not telling me?" She looked at me steadily across the small space. "Quite a bit, but enough for tonight." We negotiated terms. I said that in questions of movement and timing she should defer to my judgment, because those were areas where my experience was directly applicable. She said she would, with the condition that I explain every decision before I enacted it, not after. She was not going to be moved from one place to another based on someone else's assessment of what was best for her. She had spent 8 months trying to take back the right to make her own decisions, and she was not going to hand it to a stranger on her first night of having it back. The phrase she used was "not again." The way she said it told me there was a great deal of specific history packed into those 2 words, and that the history was recent enough to still be raw. We agreed. The night was long. Neither of us could sleep. We sat in the dark storage room with Ruth's lamp burning low between us and talked about things that did not matter, which is sometimes the only way to get to the things that do. The way autumn smells different at elevation, sharper and cleaner, and with a quality of warning in it that flatland autumn does not have. The relative intelligence of Appaloosas versus quarter horses, a subject on which she had strong opinions based on direct experience that I was not in a position to argue with. What coffee tastes like when it is made properly, and what it tastes like on the Wyoming frontier, which is to say, like something that was introduced to the concept of coffee at a distance and did its best. I cannot tell you exactly when the quality of the silence between us changed, but at some point in the small hours of the morning, it stopped being the silence of 2 strangers in a confined space and became something else. The silence of people who are paying attention to each other and have stopped feeling the need to fill the space between them with noise. It was the longest conversation I had held with another person in 2 years. I noticed that, and then tried to stop noticing it, and then gave up trying. Ruth came in before dawn with a note that had been left at the front door. No name on the outside. I opened it and read 3 words in handwriting that I recognized the way you recognize something you hoped not to see. "I know you. Calhoun Briggs?" I put the note in the lamp flame and held it until there was nothing left. Then I sat with the knowledge that 2 years of careful anonymity had ended and that the clock was now running in a direction I could not affect. The woman across from me looked at my face and said, "What was it?" I said, "A complication. We should move soon." She said, "That is not an answer to my question either." She was right again. The name I had been using for 2 years was Daniel Holt. Before that, I was Brennan Cole McCready, Pinkerton detective, field agent out of the Denver office, 6 years of service, and a file that described me as reliable, observant, and effective. The file did not mention what happened to those qualities in the winter of 1870, when I executed a legal arrest order on a man named Seamus Callahan and delivered him to a county jail in which he spent the next 14 months before a circuit judge reviewed his case and dismissed every charge against him. The file also did not mention that in those 14 months, Seamus Callahan contracted a lung illness from the damp and cold of a facility not built for long-term habitation, or that by the time his case was reviewed and he was released, The illness had established itself in his chest with the permanence of a structural feature, or that the man I had found working his farm peacefully, showing no signs of the fraudulent intent attributed to him by the creditor who had hired us, was going to spend the rest of his life paying the cost of 14 months in a place I had put him. I left the Pinkerton agency 3 months after Seamus Callahan was released. Not because I was asked to leave, because I had run out of ways to be in that building without seeing, in every face and every file folder and every new case assigned, the specific shape of what I had done and what I had declined to examine before I did it. I had taken a legal order and executed it without looking hard enough at the man the order described. I had done my job. In doing my job, I had destroyed a man's health and given 2 years of a young woman's life to the kind of fear that does not wash off. I built a cabin. I found a name that was not mine. I kept moving. Calhoun Briggs had been my partner for 2 of my 6 years at Pinkerton. He knew my real name. He knew the Callahan case. And he had been working as Harlan Voss's deputy for 6 years, which meant whatever he knew about me was available to the most dangerous man in Crestfall County the moment Briggs decided to make it available. I had 24 hours, possibly less. The morning after the note, I was working through what that meant when Ellie was not where I expected her to be. Not gone, not fled, not frightened off, simply absent from the storage room, which she had apparently decided to leave on her own schedule for her own purposes. I found her 20 minutes later at the blacksmith shop on the south end of Main Street. She was inside, standing across the work table, from a man of about 30 with the broad shoulders and careful stillness of someone who processes situations before he enters them. They were talking. The conversation was already several minutes old when I arrived, which meant she had sought him out without waiting for my assessment of whether he was trustworthy, had made her own assessment, and had acted on it. His name was Thomas Garrett. He had come to Dusthaven 10 years prior as a surveying assistant for a geological company contracted to assess land values in the Wyoming Territory. He had stayed because the town needed a blacksmith, and he told us in the particular way of a man choosing his words with precision because he had a reason to remain near something he had witnessed. He did not elaborate on what that reason was. Not yet. He offered us the use of the back room, which had a tunnel exit through the old foundation built by the previous owner during a previous variety of trouble, and said he was paying attention to whether we were the right people. I noted that Ellie had a network in this town that I had known nothing about. Her father had brought equipment to Tom Garrett's shop across 3 seasons. She had assessed him as trustworthy based on a history of interactions that predated my arrival by years, and she had acted on that assessment independently while I was still calculating. I filed this away. It was the kind of thing that matters. I went to find Briggs myself. He was at the stockyard fence at dusk when I arrived, as if he had known I would come, which he probably had. He had always been a good reader of how a situation would develop. It was one of the things that had made him a good partner back when being a good partner was something I could assess without the weight of what came after. He made his offer cleanly and without preamble. I surrender Eleanor Callahan to his custody. He removes my real name from any documentation Voss has access to. I walk away from Dusthaven with my anonymity intact, and my life in the shape it was in before I stopped at Ruth's boarding house. Simple. Professional. The kind of offer that makes complete practical sense if the woman in question is just a complication rather than a person. I ran the calculation. I want to be honest about this. I ran it for approximately 10 seconds, standing at that stockyard fence in the dying light, and the calculation was genuine. I did not know Eleanor Callahan well, Lenore. I had no history with her that obligated me. My life, such as it had become, was functional. The cabin was adequate. The isolation was not pleasant, but it was manageable. I had been managing it for 2 years. Then I thought about the way she had looked around that room. The way she had moved her gaze from face to face, not frantically, not desperately, but with a specific kind of methodical hope. The hope of someone who knows the odds and is checking anyway. And the way the checking had not ended in surprise when the faces turned away. The way she had already been prepared for exactly that result, which meant it had happened to her before, multiple times, recently enough that she had incorporated it into her expectations. She had been prepared for abandonment. She had built a preparation for it into her operating assumptions. I know what it is to need something from the world and have the world demonstrate repeatedly that it does not intend to provide it. I know what that preparation looks like from the inside. I said no. Briggs looked at me for a moment. His expression was not angry. It was something more complicated than anger. Something that might have been, under different circumstances, recognition. He said, "You just signed both your death warrants." He turned to go, and then he stopped for just a fraction of a second and looked toward Ruth's boarding house. His face changed. It was so brief that I might have missed it if I had not been watching. But I caught it. Something older than professionalism and colder than calculation. Something that had been living in him for a long time and was still alive despite everything he had done to contain it. I filed it away and went back to Tom's shop. Tom had been at the far side of the stockyard during the conversation. He stepped out from behind the fence rail and said, "I have been waiting 10 years for the right people to come to this town. I am not certain yet that you are them, but I am paying attention." Then he went back to his work. Ellie asked me that night, sitting in Tom's back room while the wind came down off the bighorns and found every gap in the old walls, what had happened with Briggs. I told her the relevant facts, the shared history, the offer made, the offer declined. I did not tell her about the 10 seconds. She listened without expression. When I finished, she said, "Are you going to do the right thing this time?" Not accusatory, not a test. A genuine question from a person who needed genuine information in order to make a genuine decision. I said, "I am trying." She nodded once. "That will have to be enough for now." We had to leave Dust Haven, that night if possible. The window of safety was closing. Ellie agreed to this with one condition. They had to stop at the family farm first. Her father needed to know she was alive. And there was something at the farm, she said, that she needed to retrieve. She did not tell me what it was. I did not ask. We rode out of Dust Haven in the last hour before midnight through the back of Tom's property and north along the creek bed where the water noise would cover the sound of the horses. The town lights faded behind us. The cold settled in around us like something with patience and intention. Ash moved under me with the steady reliability she had shown across 3 territories without complaint, and I was grateful for her in the way you are grateful for anything that does not require explanation. Ellie rode her gray mare beside me, not speaking, her face turned forward toward whatever was coming, whatever she was carrying from the conversation with her father that I had not yet been told about. She was carrying it the way she carried everything, with the specific uprightness of someone who has decided that posture is a form of dignity, and dignity is non-negotiable. I rode beside her and did not speak, and thought about what I was riding toward. The Callahan farm was a collection of darker shapes against a dark sky when we arrived. The main house, a small barn, a corral that needed work along its northern fence line. A single lamp burning in the kitchen window, which told me that Seamus Callahan either kept late hours or had known somehow that this night might be the night. We came in through the barn, secured the horses, and went to the house. Seamus Callahan was at the kitchen table. 60 years old, perhaps, or 60, trying to do the work of 75 with a body that was not keeping up with the assignment. The thinness of illness, the careful movements of someone in whom something important is not working correctly. He had the look of a man who had been handsome in another decade and was using the architecture of that former self to hold his current presentation together. When the door opened and he saw Ellie, his face did not show the relief I expected. It showed fear. I excused myself to see to the horses and went back to the barn. I stood there with Ash and Clover in the particular companionable silence of horses at rest, and did not attempt to hear through the walls. Some conversations belonged to the people having them. The kitchen window threw a rectangle of yellow light across the barn floor. I watched it and waited. 20 minutes later, Ellie came out. The look on her face was the look of someone standing in a structure from which a load-bearing element has just been removed, trying to determine whether the rest of it is going to hold. She said, "Come inside. He wants to tell you something." Seamus Callahan had not been coerced. That was the piece of it. The thing she had not yet known, and was only now learning, and was still processing as she sat across the table from her father and held her hands together in her lap with the specific stillness of someone converting the shock of a revelation into something she could live with. Voss had come to Seamus with the contract already prepared and a presentation designed for a man whose back was against a financial wall. He had been patient. He had been reasonable. He had described, in terms that were technically accurate, the comfort and security and social position that Eleanor would have as Harlan Voss's wife. He had not threatened. He had offered. He had made the offer to a man who was afraid and alone and had been unable to think clearly since his wife died 6 years before. And the offer had looked to that man in that state like a way to give his daughter something he was no longer capable of providing himself. He had signed because he loved her. He had done her a great harm because he loved her. He understood that those two facts did not cancel each other out. I said, looking at Seamus across the table, "A person can love someone and still do them a great harm. I know that from the inside." Both of them looked at me. The weight in my voice had given something away that I had not intended to give. Ellie studied my face for a moment with the precision she applied to everything, and whatever she read there she filed away for later. Seamus studied me with the different kind of precision of an older man measuring a younger one. Before we left, he took me to the barn alone. He said, "Third plank from the south wall. Loose at the left nail, there is a box underneath. Do not let Voss get to it. Do not show Eleanor until you are somewhere safe." He paused. "Promise me." I promised. What I did not know, standing there in that barn making that promise, was that Eleanor Callahan already knew about the box, had known about it for 2 years, and had made her own private decision about when to reveal that knowledge and to whom, based on criteria she had not yet shared with me. I would find this out later. When I did, I would understand that she had been assessing my trustworthiness from the first moment, and had simply not informed me that she was doing so. We were back on the horses and 20 minutes north when the sound reached us. Hoofbeats from the east approach, multiple riders, moving with the coordinated urgency of a search. Voss's men had tracked her to the farm. We pushed into the dark and did not stop until the sound was behind us and fading. The trail north and into the foothills took us through terrain that I knew and Voss's men did not, which was the only advantage we had, and I intended to use it entirely. We rode hard for 2 hours, and then walked the horses through a creek crossing that would break our trail, and then climbed into the timber where the ground was rocky enough to hold no clear print. Ellie rode through all of it without complaint. She was a competent horsewoman, not flashy, not showing off, simply someone who knew what she was doing and did it without requiring supervision. I appreciated that more than I said at the time. We made cold camp in a narrow draw with good cover on 3 sides, and I told her we would move again before first light. She said she understood and went to check on Clover's feet, which showed me something about her practical priorities that I noted and approved of. The first night she slept, and I did not. The second night, I had apparently convinced my body that continued vigilance was not a reasonable expectation, because I woke to find it was nearly dawn, and nothing had come for us in the dark, which meant we had probably broken the trail well enough to buy a day. On the second morning, climbing into the foothills proper, Clover threw a shoe on a rocky stretch. I dismounted and fixed it by feel in the poor light before sunrise, the kind of repair you learn to make when there is no alternative. Ellie held the small lantern and watched my hands without offering advice, which suggested she had made an assessment of whether her input would help, and had decided it would not. When I stood and she handed me the lantern, she said, "You work like someone who knows the difference between what can be saved and what cannot." I said, "You learn it faster when you get it wrong a few times." She looked at me for a moment with something shifting in her expression, not softening exactly, more like a lens coming into slightly better focus. Then she went to check Clover's other feet, and we rode on. That night, with a fire small enough to be invisible from below, and the stars overhead doing what Wyoming stars do at altitude, which is to occupy the entire available sky without apology, she talked about her mother. Not with grief, though grief was present underneath it, the way a geological layer is present underneath the surface of a landscape even when you cannot see it directly. She talked about her mother the way you talk about someone you are still trying to become. The self-taught reading, the almanac, and the Bible on the shelf. The conviction, passed from mother to daughter over years of Wyoming winters, that a woman who could read could do anything the reading could prepare her for. She had wanted to be a teacher. She still might be, if any of this worked out the way it needed to. I listened. Not the way I had been trained to listen, which is for information and gaps and the shape of what is being withheld. I just listened. It was strange to notice how different that felt. She stopped talking and looked at me across the fire. "You never speak about the future." I said I had gotten out of the habit of planning beyond the current day. She was quiet for a moment. "Then, that is not surviving. That is dying slowly enough that no one holds a funeral." The words landed with the precision of something aimed carefully. I did not respond immediately. I sat with them for a while, and they sat in me the way things sit in you when they are true, and you have been avoiding them. The third day brought us to the edge of the foothills where the timber thickened, and the trails became my territory, known and marked by 2 years of riding them alone. By mid-afternoon of the fourth day, Ash was picking her way along the last switchback before the cabin came into view. My cabin was small and sufficient and had been built for solitude. 3 rooms, log walls chinked with mud and moss, a stone fireplace on the north side, 1 window facing west, which I had put there because I had not, when I built it, been thinking about morning light. Ellie walked through the door and stood in the center of the main room and took it in. The bare walls, the single chair, the shelf with ammunition and preserved food, and nothing that suggested a person who expected to be comfortable. The window that showed the late afternoon mountains going purple in the diminishing light. She said, "It needs a window on the east side." She said it the way she said most things, not as a criticism, not as a suggestion, but as a statement of observable fact. This thing is true. It would be useful to acknowledge it. I looked at the cabin I had been living in for 2 years and saw it briefly through her eyes. It was sufficient. I had built it to be sufficient. I had deliberately not built it to be anything more than that. Because building something for more than one person requires an expectation of more than one person, and I had not intended to have that expectation again. I said, "I did not plan for company." She said, "No, that is quite obvious." She set her saddlebag down and began checking the food stores, learning where things were by looking rather than by asking. Tom arrived the following afternoon by a different route, on a horse that showed the miles, and brought enough news to occupy the evening. The immediate situation was that Voss had filed a complaint with the county sheriff, describing Eleanor as a missing person under suspicious circumstances. This was how he managed public relations. He did not pursue openly. He manufactured a legal framework that made his pursuit look like civic concern. Briggs had been conspicuously absent from the deputy's office for 2 days, which Tom read as significant, but could not yet interpret. We had time. Not much of it, but some. I was outside at the woodpile on the 5th morning doing what you do when you need to think and need to do something with your hands simultaneously, when the hunting party appeared on the lower trail. 3 men, moving with the easy purposefulness of people who know the terrain, which meant they were local or had been guided. I watched them from the ridge for long enough to take their measure. One of them, older, gray-bearded, with the kind of economical movement that comes from decades of being paid to pay attention, had a look that I recognized the way you recognize a species in the field. Trained observer. The particular posture that the Pinkerton Agency produced in quantity during my years with them. He had not placed me yet, but he was going to, given proximity. I came down from the ridge and went inside and said quietly to Ellie, 3 hunters on the lower trail. One of them may know my face. We have about 4 minutes. She looked at me for exactly 2 seconds. Then she picked up a dish towel, dried her hands on it, set it on the counter, and walked to the door. She opened it and stepped out onto the step as the hunters came within hailing distance. She called out a greeting in the tone of a woman who is at home where she stands and has no particular concern about visitors. She asked if they were heading up toward Osprey Creek because her husband had been meaning to ride up that way when the fence repair was done, and she hoped the fishing was still good this time of year. The gray-bearded man's eyes moved between her and me. He was running the calculation. The picture in front of him was a woman comfortable on her own threshold, and a man beside her who had the look of someone with a long list of things that needed doing and a limited number of daylight hours in which to do them. The picture did not match whatever he was looking for. They moved on. When they were out of earshot, Ellie came back inside and set the dish towel on the counter again. She said, "You are a credible husband, for someone who did not know he was going to be one." I said, "I will try to determine whether that is a compliment." She said, "It is an observation." But the corner of her mouth moved in a way that I recognized over the following days and weeks and months as what happened to her face immediately before she allowed herself to actually smile. A micro-adjustment, an almost imperceptible relaxation of control. The full smile, when it came, was the most complete change I had ever seen in a person's face. It made her look like someone who had been given permission to exist without armor. I noted it and then tried very hard to stop noting it and succeeded only partially. That night I sat outside in the cold that came off the high country after dark and let myself be honest with the mountains, because the mountains do not repeat what you tell them. I told them that I had spent 2 years learning to need nothing and want nothing and expect nothing, and that something in the previous week had broken that education so thoroughly that I could not identify the mechanism by which it had been broken, only that it had been, and that the breakage was not something I knew how to repair or was certain I wanted to repair. The mountains did not have an opinion about this. That was what I appreciated about them. We went back for the box 8 days after leaving Dust Haven, when Tom had confirmed the watch pattern at the Callahan farm and identified a 15-minute window between the midnight guard rotation that gave us what we needed. The plan was simple. Tom at the road, creating a disturbance sufficient to pull the watch north. Ellie and I through the barn's back window and to the south wall and back out. 15 minutes. Less if possible. Simple plans are the ones that almost work. The distraction held. The window was exactly large enough and exactly inconvenient enough that going through it required the kind of ungraceful commitment that does not leave room for hesitation. Ellie went first, dropped into the hay without a sound, and was moving before I had both feet inside. No lamp. She navigated the dark barn the way you navigate a space you know by memory. Without hesitation, without checking, with the specific confidence of someone who has walked this floor in the dark before and knows where the gaps are. She went straight to the south wall. She found the 3rd plank and the loose nail by feel. She lifted out the box and held it out to me. In the dark, her fingers found mine without any searching for them. We were close enough that I could hear her breathing. Neither of us said anything about any of that. There was too much already being said by the silence. We were back through the window and into the tree line before the new guards finished their rotation. Back at the camp we had made in a dry ravine 2 miles from the farm, Ellie opened the box by firelight. Inside, a geological survey dated 1871, certified by the Federal Land Office, bearing the seal and signature of the engineer who had conducted it. A document describing, in the careful technical language of someone who understood what he was looking at, the mineral composition of the rock formations beneath the Callahan property. Specifically, a silver deposit of significant size, accurately charted, documented with the precision of a man who wanted his findings to be indisputable. And beneath the survey, a letter. Seamus Callahan's handwriting addressed to Eleanor, dated 3 months prior. She read it slowly. When she finished, she read it again. Then she set it down on the ground beside her and looked at the fire. Voss had known about the silver before he ever set foot in Seamus Callahan's kitchen. He had known before the first loan went bad, before the terms changed, before the debt compounded past the point where the farm's income could address it. The debt had not been a streak of bad luck. It had been manufactured. Voss working through the bank he controlled, adjusting terms, calling in favors, engineering the specific financial desperation that would make a man in Seamus Callahan's situation sign whatever was put in front of him. Her father had not been weak. He had been targeted by someone who was practiced at it, who had done it before, who would go on doing it to other people for as long as the machinery he had built kept running. She said quietly and carefully, "He did not fail me because he stopped loving me. He failed me because someone built the exact situation that would make a loving man make the wrong choice." I said, "Yes." She looked up at me. Something in my voice, the weight in it, the specific quality of someone speaking from experience rather than observation, told her that more was coming. She waited. I said, "There is something I need to tell you before we go any further. I need you to know it before you decide anything else about this." She set her hands in her lap and looked at me across the fire and waited. I told her about 8 years ago. A creditor retained the Pinkerton agency to locate and return a man named Seamus Callahan, alleged to have defaulted on a business contract and absconded with funds that did not belong to him. I was assigned the case. I found him in 3 weeks. He was not hiding, because a man who has done nothing wrong does not hide. He was farming. He was quiet and ordinary and showed none of the signs of the fraudulent operator described in the file I had been given. I brought him in anyway. I had a legal order. I had a job. I had 6 years of practice at executing the legal machinery of the people who paid us without examining the machinery too carefully, because examining it carefully was not something the agency encouraged, and was not something I had yet been forced by circumstance to do. He was jailed for 14 months. In those 14 months, in a county facility not built for long-term occupancy, he contracted a lung illness. When a circuit judge reviewed his case and dismissed every charge, he walked out of that jail thinner than he had walked in and with something in his chest that was not going to leave. The illness killing him slowly when we sat in his kitchen was mine to account for. I had done it legally. I had done it in the execution of a lawful order. Neither of those things changed what it cost him. The fire crackled. Somewhere in the dark, a coyote said something to the mountains, and the mountains did not answer. Ellie sat very still across from me for a long time. She said, "You are the reason my father is dying. Not raised, not breaking. A statement of fact being placed carefully in its correct position in an understanding of events that was being rebuilt from the ground up." I said, "I am part of the reason." "Yes." She picked up the box. She stood. She looked at me for one long moment. Not with hatred, which would have been easier, but with the expression of someone running a very complicated calculation that involves variables she did not have until 30 seconds ago, and is not yet certain how they change the result. She said, "We have work to do before Cheyenne. We move at dawn." She walked to her bedroll. She did not look at me again that night. I sat by the fire for a long time after. Tom, who had returned from the farm distraction and had assessed the atmosphere of the camp with his characteristic precision and was giving it a wide berth, kept watch from the far edge of the ravine and said nothing. I did not try to explain myself further. The thing I had done was what it was. I had told the truth about it to the person who had the most right to hear it. The rest was hers to decide. I had been carrying it for 8 years. I had carried it by running from it. I had spent 8 years maintaining the distance between myself and anything that required me to be someone accountable for what I had done. Sitting by that fire in the dark, I understood that the running was over. Not because I had resolved anything. Because Eleanor Callahan now knew what I had done, and I was still here, and I did not want to be anywhere else. That was new. That was something I had not felt in 8 years. I did not examine it too carefully. I watched the fire and let the night move through me and waited for dawn. We rode for Cheyenne in a cold that arrived overnight and made no promises about leaving. The high country behind us was already showing white on the peaks, and the smell in the air had that particular quality of Wyoming autumn that is also the smell of Wyoming winter, making its intentions known. Ellie rode to my left, not beside me in the way that people ride together when they are comfortable with each other. Beside me in the way that people ride when they are in the same situation and have not yet decided what that means for the question of whether they are on the same side. She spoke when logistics required it. She directed questions about the route to Tom when possible. She was not cold. She was precise, which is different. She had received information that required processing, and she was processing it, and she was not going to pretend to have finished until she had. I respected that. I have never had much patience for people who perform emotional resolution faster than emotional resolution actually occurs. Tom rode ahead or behind, reading the terrain and the weather and giving us whatever space the trail allowed. He had the quality of a person who understands that his presence can be useful without being intrusive, and who has developed the skill of being the former without becoming the latter. We camped the first night on a flat rock shelf above the timberline, where the wind made conversation difficult and the stars made philosophy seem appropriate. Tom built the fire. Ellie checked the horses. I cleaned my rifle and watched the dark below the ridge for anything that moved against the wind. She came and sat near the fire as the temperature dropped past the point of comfort. After a while, she said, without looking at me, "I'm not done being angry." I said, "I know." She said, "But you told me when you did not have to, when the easier choice was to let me go on not knowing." I said nothing. She said, "I'm still working out what to do with that." I said, "Take the time you need." The words carried more than I intended them to carry. The weight of someone saying, "I am not going anywhere," without saying it directly, because saying it directly would be a claim I had not yet earned the right to make. She went to her bedroll. I went back to watching the dark. The second day brought us down out of the high country and onto the rolling terrain that led southeast toward the territorial capital. Better road, better time, but more exposure. We were in country that people traveled regularly now, and a woman with a determined expression and two men with trail dust on them attracted more notice than three shadows moving through timber. On the afternoon of the second day, I made a mistake. I knew a circuit court clerk in Cheyenne from my Pinkerton years, a man named Walter who had survived 6 changes of administration by being reliably inconspicuous and reliably accurate about which way the legal wind was blowing. I wanted to know whether the federal judge currently sitting in Cheyenne was a Voss appointment or an independent one. That information would determine our approach to the courthouse considerably. I sent Tom ahead to make contact with Walter at a specific location. I did not tell Ellie I was doing this, because she had been carrying enough, and I did not want to add another uncertainty to the list until I had information that would make it useful rather than just worrying. Walter passed us on the road 2 hours later and tipped his hat at me by my real name. Ellie heard it. She did not react in the moment. She waited until Tom had gone ahead to scout and we were riding alone. Then she said, in the even and precise voice she used when she was containing something large, "You made a decision that affected both of us without telling me." I said, "I was trying to avoid adding another." She said, "You were protecting me from information. That is what my father did. That is what Voss did. That is the specific thing I asked you not to do." She was right. I had told myself I was protecting her. What I had actually been doing was protecting myself from the discomfort of watching her absorb one more hard thing. That is not the same as protecting her, and I had known the difference when I made the decision and chosen not to see it. I said, "You are right." She said, "I know I am," and rode forward to where Tom had stopped at a ridgeline and did not look back. We camped the second night in a dry wash where the banks gave us cover. Tom built the fire and made coffee and went to see to the horses with the tact of a man who has read a situation and understood that his absence would serve it better than his presence. After a while, I went to where Ellie was standing at the edge of the firelight, looking out at the dark. I said, "Tomorrow, before I do anything at all, I will ask you first, every step, No exceptions. She was quiet for a moment. She said, "That is all I was asking for." She went back to the fire. I stood in the dark for a moment, alone with the sound of the wind and the distant complaint of something nocturnal about something that had displeased it. Then I went back to the fire as well. We had 2 more days to Cheyenne. Briggs found us on the morning of the 3rd day. He came on foot, which told me he had left his horse behind deliberately to break any trail between him and whoever might be following him. He came with his hands visible and his badge in his pocket, and the expression of a man who's arrived at a decision he did not think he was going to arrive at. He sat down at the fire we had just built for the morning meal and told us what he had been holding. For the previous 3 months, Eleanor Callahan had been making her legal challenges, filing her motions, arguing her case, under the assumption that her father was dead. The news of Seamus Callahan's death had been delivered by Voss's lawyer, confirmed by a doctor who was on Voss's payroll, and memorialized by a grave marker outside of Dusthaven that held whatever Voss had decided to put in it. Seamus Callahan was alive. He was being held in the basement of a townhouse Voss maintained in Cheyenne for business travel. He had been there for 3 months, under guard, kept in reasonable physical condition because a dead hostage is a hostage whose leverage has expired. Voss had been watching Ellie's legal challenges with the specific equanimity of a man who knows that no matter how hard she pushes, she will never push hard enough because the thing she would need to push with full force, she believes she has already lost. She had been fighting with one hand tied behind her back for 3 months, and the hand had been tied by a lie. Ellie sat very still while Briggs spoke. She did not interrupt. She did not show what she was feeling, except in the particular quality of her stillness, which had a different character from her ordinary stillness. Denser. Something happening inside it at very high speed. When Briggs finished, she said, "Where is he?" Briggs told her. The townhouse, the rail district, 2 blocks from the freight offices, basement room, single rotating guard. She said, "Then we get him first." I said, "Agreed." Tom, who had heard everything, opened his saddlebag. Inside, 2 documents. The first was the original geological survey of the Callahan land, the one that had been conducted honestly and filed with the Federal Land Office and then quietly superseded. It bore the federal seal, the engineer's signature, the date, the findings. A silver deposit charted accurately. The second was the revised version that Voss had submitted to the Territorial Land Office 1 year later, with specific sections rewritten in a different hand, the silver deposit notation removed entirely, the assessed value of the property reduced to less than 1/3 of its actual worth. Tom had kept both for 10 years. He had also kept a letter from the senior engineer of the survey company, who had noticed the falsification and documented his concerns before being quietly removed from his position. He set the 2 documents side by side on the ground between us. Ellie picked them up and held them in both hands and read the differences between them with the focused precision of someone who has spent years studying legal language and knows exactly what she is seeing. She said, "This is federal fraud. This is not a county matter. This is a federal crime." Tom said, "Across 4 counties. 17 properties that I can document." Briggs said, "There is a federal land commissioner named Aldridge currently in Cheyenne for the quarterly review. He has been looking at Voss's acquisition patterns for 3 years. He's been waiting for the piece that makes the picture complete." Ellie set the documents down. She looked at me. The anger was still there. The process was still ongoing. But underneath both of those things was something that had been building across the days of riding and the nights of fire and the conversation at the stockyard fence that I had told her about, and the moment in the barn when her fingers had found mine without searching. Something deliberate. A person choosing, consciously and without illusion, to extend trust they have every reason not to extend. She said, "You said every decision, every step." I said it. I meant it. She said, "Then here is what we are doing. We get my father first, then Aldridge." I know the rail district in Cheyenne. I have been there. I know the building layout. Tell me what you need from me, and I will tell you if I have it. I said, tell me everything you remember. She told me. She had been to Cheyenne once, at 16 with her father, to file a land registration. She remembered the rail district, the streets, the spacing of the buildings, the location of the freight offices. She remembered passing the block where Voss's townhouse stood, because her father had pointed it out as belonging to a man with a great deal of influence in the territory, said in the tone adults use when they mean a man, it would be wise not to displease. She remembered which side of the building faced the alley. She remembered that the service entrance was on the north side, sheltered from the street view by a garden wall. She had been carrying all of it, waiting until it was useful. I looked at her across the fire in the early morning cold, with the documents between us and the mountains behind us, and Cheyenne 2 days ahead, and understood something that I had been moving toward for 10 days without knowing I was moving toward it. She was not someone who needed to be protected from information. She was someone who collected it, held it, used it at the right moment, and had been doing so since long before I arrived. What she had needed was not protection. What she had needed was someone who would stand beside her and not turn away when the situation became the kind of situation that makes people turn away. I said, Ellie? She looked at me. I said, I am sorry. For your father, for 8 years ago, for the decision I made without asking you 2 days ago, for all of it. She held my gaze for a long moment. Then, I know, that matters. A pause that had the weight of something being decided in it. It does not fix everything, but it matters. That was more than I had any right to ask for. We broke camp and rode for Cheyenne. Cheyenne was the territorial capital in full autumn operation, which meant freight wagons and rail workers and businessmen from back east with the particular look of people who have come to acquire something and are confident in their ability to do so. Larger than Dust Haven by a factor that made comparison almost irrelevant. More cover, more noise, more people who had their own business to attend to, and no interest in anyone else's. We came in separately. Tom first with an hour's lead. Briggs next, badge in his pocket, moving like a man with ordinary business. Ellie and I last, from the North Road, dressed down and unremarkable and sitting our horses like people going somewhere specific and minding their own concerns. Tom had arranged a room at a hotel near the rail yard. 3rd floor, backside, window over the alley. The kind of room that rents to people who need to not be noticed and are willing to pay a modest premium for the ability. We gathered there in the late afternoon and laid out what we knew. The Voss townhouse was 2 blocks from the freight offices. Brick, 2 stories, with the garden wall on the north side that Ellie remembered. The basement access through the service corridor, single guard rotating every 12 hours. The next rotation would happen at 6 in the morning. We had until then. Briggs would go to the front. His badge, technically still valid, gave him grounds to present himself at the door under any number of plausible pretexts. Keep the front of the house occupied. Prevent anyone from coming around to the service entrance without warning. Tom would take the alley, watch the exits, signal if anything changed. Ellie and I through the service entrance and down. I looked at her. Any part of that you want to change? She said, no, that is exactly right. We went at 5:40 in the morning, in the gray that precedes Wyoming sunrise, when the city is between its versions of itself and not paying full attention to either. The cold was the kind that makes every breath visible, every surface metallic, every sound carry further than it does in warmer months. Tom went to the alley. Briggs straightened his badge and went around to the front. Ellie and I went through the side gate. She led, knowing the approach from memory, moving quietly in the way of someone who has decided not to hesitate. The garden wall, the service entrance, the door unlocked for the morning delivery, exactly as she had predicted it would be. Inside, stone floors, low ceilings, the smell of a building that has been heated for years by fires that never quite reached the back half of it. A corridor left toward the kitchen, a corridor right and down. We went right. The basement was cold and dark, and had the particular quality of a space that had been lived in against its will. A low ceiling, a single lamp at the end of the corridor, burning at the lowest setting that still justified the name. 3 doors, 2 of them open onto rooms that held nothing. The third at the corridor's end, closed. Locked. 40 seconds. The door opened. Seamus Callahan was on the edge of the cot in the small room, sitting upright, fully awake, looking at the door. He had the look of a man who had decided some time ago to be ready for whatever came through it, and had been maintaining that readiness through sheer will for longer than it should have been required of him. He saw Ellie. He said, "I told you not to come." She crossed the room in 3 steps and held his face in both hands and did not say anything. She just looked at him, making sure he was present, making sure he was real, making sure that the lamp was not a trick of a basement and weeks of bad sleep and the kind of hope that can start to look like imagination. He was real. He was thinner, and the illness in his chest was audible, but his eyes were clear, and his hands, when he reached up to cover hers, were steady. She said, "I know, Dad. That is exactly why I came." He looked past her at me. I had known this moment was coming since Briggs told us Seamus was alive. I had thought about what I would say. All of the things I had considered were either insufficient or dishonest, and the man in front of me had earned the right to neither. He said, "You are the Pinkerton." I said, "Yes, sir." He looked at me with the expression of a man who has had a great deal of time to think and has used it. "You are helping my daughter. Trying to. You did me a great wrong. I know it." A silence. The full weight of 8 years in it. And then, not absolution, not yet, not something that arrived all at once and dissolved the years between us, but an acknowledgement, the beginning of something that might become more than acknowledgement, given time and the willingness to do the work. He said, "A man trying to make right what he has made wrong is the most useful kind as long as he keeps trying." He reached for my arm. "Help me up." I gave him my arm and he stood. We were at the top of the service corridor, Seamus between me and Ellie, when we heard Voss's voice from the front of the house. Not raised, controlled. The voice of a man who had decided something before he arrived and was executing the decision. Harlan Voss was in the front hallway. He was dressed for a business meeting, a tailored coat, polished boots, the specific presentation of someone who understands that authority is partly costume. He had 2 men with him. He looked at Seamus on my arm, at Ellie beside me, at Tom visible through the kitchen door, at Briggs, who was still in the hallway with his badge out and his expression neutral. His face ran through calculations so fast they barely registered as expressions before they were replaced by the next one. He said, "Eleanor, this does not have to continue in this direction." She said, "It is continuing in this direction regardless." He looked at her with the expression of a man who genuinely cannot understand how someone in her position could have fought this effectively. He had built the constraints carefully. He had taken every exit he could identify. He had made the arithmetic impossible. He said, and this was the most honest I ever heard him, "I came from nothing. My father died in a place that did not record his name. I built everything you see from that place, from that nothing. From the specific knowledge of what it is to have no one and nothing standing between you and what the world decides to do to you." He paused. "I made a vow that I would never again be in a position where anything could be taken from me. I made that vow before I understood what honoring it would require me to become." He was not asking for anything, not mercy, not understanding. He was explaining, the only way he knew how. Ellie said, "The difference between a thing and a person is that a person can walk away from you." She stepped forward. "We are walking away, Mr. Voss. You can allow that to happen and face one set of federal charges. Or you can attempt to prevent it and add obstruction to the list. Thomas Garrett holds the original survey documents and the falsification alongside it. Deputy Briggs is prepared to provide full testimony. Commissioner Aldridge is expecting us in his office in 40 minutes. Voss looked at the documents in Tom's hand, at Briggs's badge, at Seamus standing upright, alive and destroying the entire architecture of the leverage Voss had been using for 3 months, At the decade of documented fraud about to arrive on a federal desk, with everything it needed to be acted upon, he said, "This is not over." His voice had changed. It was the voice of a man who already knows that it is. Briggs stepped forward and put his hand on Voss's arm and identified himself and stated the grounds for arrest in the formal language of a man who had spent 15 years in law enforcement and knew how to do this correctly even when the everything around him was anything but. The two men behind Voss looked at each other. They were hired for their specific skills, not for loyalty that would carry them past the point where the math stopped working. They stepped back. Voss allowed himself to be turned toward the door with the dignity of a man who has decided that how he is seen in this moment is the only thing he retains. He walked out into the Cheyenne morning. We followed him into the cold gray light, 5 people and 1 man who was learning what outside felt like again, and began the last part of what had begun in a market day boarding house in a town that smelled of surrender. Commissioner Aldridge received us at 7 in the morning. He was a compact man of about 55, who had the quality of someone who has spent a career listening carefully and responding slowly, not because his thinking is slow, but because he understands that speaking before you have finished thinking is the source of most of the avoidable errors in law and government. He received Tom's documents, read them once, asked 3 questions, read them again. He read Ellie's original survey from the box alongside the falsified version. He listened to Briggs give a summary of his 6 years of observation and the specific incidents he was prepared to testify to. Then he sent his assistant out and sat alone with all of us for a moment. He said, "Miss Callahan, on behalf of the Federal Land Office and the Territorial Administration, I want to say that what you have done here, the documentation you have assembled, the persistence with which you pursued this, is the kind of work that this office depends on private citizens to do because we do not always have the reach to do it ourselves. This outcome would not have been possible without you." Ellie said, "I had help." She looked at me when she said it. I looked back at her. Neither of us said anything else about it. The orders came in sequence. A preservation order on all Callahan property. A federal warrant for Harlan Voss on 8 counts of land fraud. A referral to the territorial prosecutor for coercion and unlawful imprisonment charges. The fraudulent complaint Voss had filed against me, under the name Daniel Holt, was voided. The marriage contract was declared invalid under coercion statutes. It took 2 hours. What Ellie had been building toward for 8 months and 3 weeks, what she had nearly died for on 2 separate occasions, what had cost her a father and a farm, and the better part of 2 years of her life. It was resolved in 2 hours of careful legal process. That is what law looks like when it works correctly. Not heroic, not dramatic, just the careful application of documented truth to a situation that has been made, finally, to sit still long enough for the documentation to be applied. We walked out of the federal building at 9 in the morning. The sun was trying to do something about the cold and mostly failing. The city was fully awake around us. Freight wagons, horses, the sound of the rail yard a few blocks east. Seamus was with Tom at the hotel resting. He had been seen by a doctor that morning, a real one, not a Voss appointment, and had received the particular combination of news that consists of things that can be improved and things that cannot be changed, delivered with the honesty of a medical professional who understands that both kinds of news deserve equal clarity. What could be improved would be improved. What could not be changed would be managed. He was alive and free, and on the right side of a door that opened from the inside, and that was more than he had expected to be when the lamp was burning low in the basement room in the early hours of 3 months of waiting. Briggs left the following morning. He came to find Ellie before he went. He stood in the hotel doorway and looked at her with an expression that had set down something it had been carrying a long time. He told her about his sister. Not all of it. You cannot tell all of something like that in a doorway, but enough. Her name was Margaret. She had been 22 years old when a man like Voss found her. He had become Voss's man in the aftermath of losing her, because he had not known how to be anything else, and had stayed because leaving required a reason he had not been given. He had been given one. He said, "She would have liked you. I think she would have recognized something in what you did." Ellie said, "I think she would have done it herself, given the chance." He nodded. He put his badge in his pocket for the last time and walked out into the Cheyenne morning, heading north. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived addressed to Ellie. No return address. It said, "Margaret would have liked you. Thank you for giving me a reason." She kept it in the box with the survey documents. I never asked her why. Some things explain themselves. I was saddling Ash in the hotel livery on the third morning when she found me. I want to be accurate about this. I was not hiding. I had not decided anything. I was doing what I do when I do not know what to do, which is attend to the practical requirements of the immediate situation, which in this case was making sure Ash was properly cared for, and her tack was in order for whatever came next. What I had not been able to determine was what came next. The work was done. The farm was saved and in Ellie's name and no longer under any legal threat. Seamus was alive and under legitimate medical care and was going to continue to be alive for the foreseeable future. Tom was already making plans for Dusthaven, where the departure of Voss's influence had begun, apparently, a considerable reorganization of the local landscape. The legal machinery was in motion and would continue without our presence. There was no reason I needed to be anywhere specific. I had been telling myself that for 2 years. Standing in that livery, I was significantly less convinced by it than I used to be. She came in without announcing herself and stood watching me work the cinch on Ash's saddle. She said, "You are leaving without telling me." I said, "I thought it might be simpler." She said, "For who?" I let go of the saddle. She came to stand beside Ash, not between me and the door, just beside. The way she stood near things, she had decided to stay near. She said, "The farm needs a great deal of work. My father needs time to recover properly. I need someone who understands that something worth building is going to take longer than expected and cost more than planned, and who is not going to be surprised by that or use it as a reason to leave." She was not looking at me. She was looking at Ash, at the saddle, at the practical reality of the space between us. She said, "I am not asking you to stay because of what you did. I am asking because there is a window missing on the east side of my house, and I appear to have misplaced the person I want to argue with about putting it in." I said, "Ellie." She looked at me. I said, "I spent 8 years carrying what I did to your father. I am not certain I am the kind of man who deserves what you are describing." She said, "I know that. That is why I am asking you instead of someone who already believes he deserves it." Ash turned her head and looked at me. Horses do this. They look at you with the patience of something that has watched your particular brand of difficulty for a long time and has quietly formed an opinion about how it should resolve. I put the saddle back on the rack. We came home on a cold morning in the first week of December, frost thick on the grass and the creek running clear and low between ice-edged banks. Seamus rode in the wagon that Tom had arranged, wrapped in blankets, looking out at the land the way a man looks at something he had prepared to never see again. When the farm came into view through the bare cottonwoods along the creek, he was quiet for a long time. He said, "Smaller than I remembered." Ellie, riding beside the wagon, said, "Most things from before are." He said, "Not you." She reached back without looking and took his hand, and he held it the rest of the way in. The farm needed everything. The house needed roofing, and a new sill on the south window, and a week's worth of attention to the interior that 2 seasons of minimal care had left in a state of accumulated neglect. The barn roof had developed a relationship with gravity that needed to be discouraged. The corral fence was down in 3 places. The kitchen garden had reverted to a general theory of plant life with no particular organizing principle. I had spent 6 years as a Pinkerton detective and 2 years as a man hiding in a mountain cabin. I had not been a farmer. I was going to have to learn. Ellie was patient with this in the way that competent people are patient with people who are genuinely trying and making genuine progress. She explained things once. She corrected without commentary. She demonstrated and then stepped back and let me develop my own version of what she had shown me, which is a teaching method that requires the teacher to tolerate imperfection in the interest of the student eventually achieving competence, and which she applied with a consistency that told me she had thought about the difference between instruction and control and had made a deliberate choice. Tom stayed for 2 weeks before returning to Dusthaven, where news of Voss's arrest had preceded us by a day, and had apparently produced, in the social and commercial fabric of the town, the kind of rapid reorganization that occurs when a great deal of pressure that has been held artificially in place is suddenly released. He had work to do. He also said he would come back in the spring with window glass for the east wall, and he was as good as his word. Seamus recovered in stages, slowly at first, then with gathering speed as the real medical attention and real food and the specific recovery that comes from sleeping without fear accumulated their effect. By February, he was on the porch for an hour each afternoon. By March, he was giving me opinions about the corral fence that were specific and accurate and slightly more frequent than strictly necessary, which I understood as his version of feeling well enough to care about things. In December, in the barn, he and I had the conversation that had been waiting since the basement in Cheyenne. He said, "I cannot give you the years back." I said, "I know." He said, "And I will not tell you that what you did was a small thing. It was not a small thing." I said, "No." He was quiet for a moment. The horses moved in their stalls. Outside, snow had begun to come down with the serious intention of Wyoming winter, which does not threaten or suggest, but simply arrives and remains. He said, "A man who is trying to be better than he has been is the most useful kind of man, as long as he does not stop trying. I have watched you with my daughter for 2 months. I have watched the way you listen to her and defer to her knowledge in the things she knows better than you, which is more things than most men would admit. I have watched you get up before dawn to do the work that needs doing without being asked to do it." He looked at me sidelong in the way he had when he made the decision in the barn in Dusthaven. "You owe me a debt you cannot pay back. I think you know that. I also think you intend to spend the rest of your life in the vicinity of trying. That matters." He turned back to the bridle hardware he was pretending to work on. He said, "There is an east window that needs to be framed before the heavy snow sets in properly. My lungs are not equal to outdoor work in this cold. Someone has to do it." I said, "I will start tomorrow." He said, "Good." The east window went in on a Tuesday in the 2-hour margin between enough morning light to work by and cold past the threshold of useful. Ellie held the level and told me when I was crooked, which was twice, and I adjusted both times and did not argue about it, which she noted with the expression that preceded the full smile by approximately 2 seconds. When the last pane was seated and the caulk was setting, she stepped back and looked at it. She said, "It is slightly uneven on the left." I said, "It is within acceptable tolerance." She said, "Whose tolerance?" I said, "Mine. I built it." She gave me the look. The one that combined exasperation and amusement in a ratio that had been shifting over the months since Cheyenne, increasingly toward amusement. The look of someone who has decided on balance that the particular variety of stubbornness in front of her is one she can work with. She said, "I want a new porch step as well. The third one flexes." I said, "One thing at a time." She said, "Is that your philosophy now?" I said, "It has been working better than the previous one." The full smile arrived. I had been watching it for 5 months. It still changed her face the same way every time, from capable and precise and entirely in possession of herself to something more open, something that belonged to the part of her that the previous 2 years had tried very hard to eliminate, and that had survived them anyway, the way some things survive because they are more essential than the forces arranged against them. That winter was hard in the way Wyoming winters are hard, without personal malice, but also without any interest in your comfort or timeline. The snow came in January and meant it. We were snowed in for 11 days in February, which is a different kind of test than the kind we had already passed. The test of whether two people who chose each other under extreme circumstances are still glad of the choice when the circumstances are ordinary. We were. That is the simple version of it. The longer version involves 11 days of close quarters and the gradual discovery that we had the same argument about 3 specific things. The proper way to bank a fire for the night, whether the horses needed to be checked more than twice in a blizzard, and the question of how long cornbread should be in the oven, and that the arguments were not actually about any of those things, and that having the same argument about the same things with the same person, when the person is the right person, is one of the specific textures of a life being built rather than endured. I did not have a word for what I had found in that farmhouse in that winter. What I had was the thing itself, which is better than the word anyway. Commissioner Aldridge's investigation took 6 months. Word came from Cheyenne in the late spring, delivered by a rider from the federal land office who presented Ellie with a sealed envelope and waited for a response that she sent back in 2 lines on a piece of paper from her father's almanac. 23 documented cases of land fraud across 4 counties. 11 of the charges against Voss resulted in convictions. He was sentenced to serve his time at the territorial prison outside Laramie, the sentence structured so that the earliest he could expect release was a matter that would occupy the better part of the following decade. His properties were being liquidated to satisfy his debts and compensate his victims. The compensation would not make anyone whole. Nothing does that. But it was something, and sometimes something is the most that justice can actually deliver, and you take it, because it is more than nothing, and doing so matters. The Callahan farm was formally registered in Eleanor's name, free of any encumbrance, with the mineral rights included. Tom had helped document the silver deposit in terms the federal land office found acceptable, and the question of what to do with the silver mine under your wheat fields was a pleasant problem compared to the problems that had preceded it. Dust Haven had a new sheriff. Ruth McAllister had attended every public meeting that involved the selection process and had communicated her assessment of each candidate with the directness of someone who has nothing to prove and no patience for the alternative. The man who was ultimately selected was, by general consensus, the right choice, and showed every sign of being the kind of person who makes that consensus correct by how he does his work. Tom's smithy had doubled in size by midsummer. With Voss's influence removed from the local economy, the town was discovering what it was when it was not being managed by someone else's agenda. The answer, slowly and with the occasional setback of anything organic, was something that more closely resembled itself. Voss sent a letter from the territorial prison in August. It was addressed to Ellie. 1 paragraph in the controlled handwriting of a man who has decided that how he is seen extends to correspondence. He said that he had spent the previous months reconsidering certain decisions and had arrived at a clearer understanding of the distinction between acquiring things and acquiring people. He said he hoped the farm was prospering. He did not ask for anything. He did not apologize exactly. He said what he was capable of saying, which was perhaps as much as could be expected from a man who had built his entire understanding of the world around a framework that had just been dismantled. Ellie read it once and put it in the box. She said, "He will not be the same person when he comes out." I said, "No." She said, "I do not know if that is a good thing or a neutral thing." I said, "Neither do I." She put the box back on the shelf. It was a summer evening, the kind that Wyoming produces in June like a counter-argument to everything the winters say about the place. Long and warm and full of the specific quality of light that the elevation gives to the last 2 hours before sunset. We were on the porch, Seamus in his chair with his coffee, Ellie beside me on the step. She said, "Do you think about what would have happened if you had ridden out of Dust Haven that first evening?" I thought about it. The honest answer, which is the only kind I had learned to give her, I would have ridden through 41 towns that looked exactly like it, and none of them would have been worth stopping in. She looked at me with the expression I know the best now, the one that holds several things at once without separating them into categories, amusement and assessment and something warmer underneath, both that has no single accurate name. She said, "You're getting better at that." I said, "At what?" She said, "Saying the thing you mean." I said, I have had a good teacher. 1 year after the morning in the livery where I put the saddle back on the rack. The Callahan farm in late summer. The fields are in. The wheat crop is the best in 4 years. The soil, it turns out, had been correctly farmed, and simply needed the seasons that had been taken from it by manufactured misfortune to recover their productive depth. The horses in the corral are 4 now. Ash is the best of them and does not require the others to acknowledge this because she already knows it. Seamus is on the porch. This is the thing I would not have believed, in the basement in Cheyenne, looking at the thin and guarded man on the edge of the cot. But there he is, in the chair that has become his chair, in the afternoon light that comes across the grass from the west, with his coffee and the view of the mountains that he told me last week. He has never entirely taken for granted since he came back from the basement room and the Cheyenne morning and the long winter of recovery. His lungs are managed. The doctor from Silver Ridge comes once a month now instead of twice, which the doctor said means the situation has stabilized at a level she is comfortable calling good news. Seamus has accepted this assessment with the particular contentment of a man who has recalibrated his expectations in a direction that allows him to appreciate what he has, rather than mourn what he does not. He told me in March, standing at the barn fence watching the horses, that he had made his peace with the 8 years. Not that he had forgotten them, or that they had ceased to be what they were. That he had placed them in their correct position in the account of things, which is to say behind him, where they could inform the present without determining it. He said, "A man can spend his life measuring what he owes against what he is owed, or he can spend it building something. The building does not cancel the debt, but it makes better use of the time." I did not have a good answer for that. He did not require one. I was at the corral on a Tuesday afternoon in late August, working on the section of fence that had developed ambitions about becoming something other than fence, when Ellie came out with 2 cups of coffee. This is not a dramatic statement. It is exactly what happened. She came out with 2 cups, handed me one, and stood watching me work in the way she has developed over the months, not supervising, not assessing, present. The way a person stands near something they have decided to stay near. I set down the fence tool. We stood in the late afternoon light, the mountains behind the property doing what the mountains do in August, which is hold the light differently from every other month, with a clarity that has something final in it, something aware of the cold that is coming but not yet diminished by it. She said, "I had a letter from Tom yesterday." I said, "What did he say?" She said, "He's thinking of running for county commissioner. The position is open. Ruth apparently told him he would be a fool not to, which he is interpreting as encouragement." I said, "Ruth telling a man he would be a fool not to do something is the highest endorsement available in that county." She almost smiled, then did. "He asked about you, whether you were still fixing fences or had moved on to something with a higher degree of difficulty." I said, "What did you tell him?" She said, "That you had graduated to the barn roof and were approaching it with your characteristic combination of thoroughness and stubbornness." I said, "Thoroughness is a virtue." She said, "So is asking for help when you need it." I said, "I have been asking for help for a year." She said, "You have been accepting help that is offered. That is different." She was right. She was almost always right about the distinctions that mattered. It was one of the things I had come to rely on, in the way you rely on a fixed point, not because it is comfortable, but because it is true, and true things are navigable. I said, "Ellie." She looked at me. I said, "I want to ask you something, and I want to do it correctly, which means I am telling you that I am asking rather than deciding, and that your answer is the answer, not the beginning of a negotiation." She set her coffee cup on the fence post. She turned to face me fully. I said, "I came to Dust Haven with a name that was not mine and a history I was running from, and no expectation of finding anything worth stopping for. I found you. I found your father in this farm and the particular thing that happens when a person decides that something is worth fighting for, even when the fighting might cost everything." I said, "I have been thinking about the east window." She said, "The window has been in for 8 months. I said, I know. I have been thinking about it since before I put it in, about what it means to put something in a house that faces the right direction, to build something that is designed for permanence rather than sufficiency. I looked at her. I would like to build more things that are designed for permanence, here with you, if that is something you want as well. She was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that has a great deal of thinking in it. She said, "You are asking me to marry you." I said, "I am asking you if that is what you want. I have learned not to make that determination independently." The full smile arrived, the one that changes her face from capable and contained to entirely itself. She said, "Yes, that is what I want." She said, "I want mornings that are not organized around survival. I want to teach. There are children in the Silver Ridge settlement who have no one. And I have been corresponding with the land office about a schoolhouse charter. I want my father to see this farm in full operation for however many seasons he has. I want to argue with you about fence repair and window alignment, and the correct amount of time for cornbread to be in the oven," she said, "and I want to do all of it with you. Because you are stubborn enough to stay when staying is hard, and honest enough to tell the truth when the truth is costly, and you have been trying every day to be better than you were." That is the thing I was looking for when I looked around that room in Dusthaven. Not a hero, just a person who would stay. I said, "I am staying." She said, "I know." She picked up her coffee cup. "The fence is not going to fix itself." I said, "I am aware of that." She said, "I will bring more coffee in an hour." She went back toward the house. At the door she turned the way she does and looked back at me for a moment, not checking, confirming. The way a person confirms something that has been decided and is now simply true. I raised one hand. She went inside. Here is what I know, standing at this fence in the late August light with the mountains behind me and the sound of the farm alive in all directions. The wolves that Dusthaven sent after Eleanor Callahan are gone. The man who sent them is answering for what he built with the specific currency of someone who built everything on paper and has now had the paper taken from him. The woman who outran them is inside that house, alive and free and building something that belongs to her. And I am here. I did not plan for here. I did not navigate toward it. I stumbled into it through bad history and one decision made correctly at a stockyard fence when a man offered me an exit, and I found, at the last possible second, that I did not want one. That decision led me to a storage room in a mountain cabin, and a dark barn, and a basement in Cheyenne, and a winter in a farmhouse in Wyoming with the snow piled 3 feet against the south wall and the fire going and the sound of 2 people and one old man building the specific ordinary thing that ordinary life consists of, which is just the accumulation of days in which you choose the same thing again. Every morning I choose it again. Every morning it is still the right choice. I spent 2 years riding away from what I was. I have spent 1 year riding toward what I want to be. The distance between those 2 directions is the whole distance between a life that is sufficient and a life that means something. The east window catches the morning light the way she said it would. It comes in across the kitchen floor in a line that moves as the sun rises. And if you are up early enough, you can watch it travel from the doorway to the table to the wall. And it is the same light it always was, falling on the same floor it always was. But the window is facing the right direction now. That is the whole of it. That is the entire story. The fence holds. The window is in. The coffee will be ready in an hour. The wolves did not keep her. Nothing could. And somewhere between a market day in a dying town and a basement in Cheyenne, and a winter that tested everything we had found and confirmed that it was real, she decided to keep me instead. I am not going to argue with that. Not today. Not ever. All characters and situations in this book are fictional and developed for narrative purposes. The author does not intend to reflect or comment on any real individual or event. Readers should approach the story as a work of fiction, not as a factual account.
At its heart, this story speaks about responsibility, courage, redemption, and the quiet power of choosing not to turn away. First, the story reminds us that evil does not always appear as chaos. It often hides within systems, within silence, within people who choose not to act. Dust Haven is not a violent town on the surface. It is something more dangerous, a place where people have stopped expecting change. That resignation, that quiet acceptance of injustice, is one of the story's central warnings. When people avert their eyes, injustice grows roots. The moral lesson here is clear. Indifference is not neutral, it is a form of participation. Second, through the character of Eleanor Callahan, we are shown the strength of moral courage and self-determination. She does not beg, she does not collapse, she fights. Not with weapons, but with knowledge, persistence, and dignity. She represents a powerful truth. True strength is not loud, but unwavering. Her refusal to surrender her agency teaches us that even in systems designed to break individuals, one person's clarity and resolve can challenge the structure itself. Third, the protagonist embodies the theme of redemption. He is a man burdened by past mistakes, mistakes made legally, yet morally devastating. The story does not excuse him, nor does it erase his guilt. Instead, it offers a more meaningful lesson. Redemption is not about undoing the past, but about choosing differently in the present, again and again. His decision to stay, to help, to face the consequences of his past, these are not heroic gestures in the traditional sense, but they are deeply moral ones. Importantly, the story teaches that doing the right thing is rarely convenient. At the stockyard fence, the protagonist is given a choice: safety or integrity. The calculation is real, and the hesitation is honest. This moment reflects a universal human truth. Morality often exists in the space between fear and action, and the lesson is simple but profound. Who we are is defined by the choices we make when walking away would be easier. Another significant theme is truth and trust. Eleanor repeatedly insists on being informed, on being treated as an equal participant in her own life. This challenges a common but flawed idea that protecting someone means deciding for them. The story teaches us that respect is not protection, it is partnership. Trust is built not by shielding others from hardship, but by standing beside them within it. Finally, the ending offers a quiet but powerful message about hope and rebuilding. The east window becomes a symbol, not just of light, but of direction. The protagonist once built a life designed for isolation and survival. Now he builds one designed for connection and meaning. The moral here is deeply human. It is never too late to turn your life toward something better. In conclusion, this story teaches us that silence in the face of injustice is dangerous. Courage is often quiet but steadfast. Redemption requires action, not regret. Trust is built through honesty and shared choice. And above all, a meaningful life is not found. It is chosen, day by day. Like the morning light through the east window, meaning does not arrive by chance. It comes when we decide to face the right direction and stay.